Prince Alexander had always found the palace grounds more interesting than the stuffy royal chambers, where tutors droned on about politics and proper etiquette. At 17, he possessed the restless energy of youth and a curiosity that his father, King Edmund, often called both a blessing and a curse. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens as Alexander made his way toward the eastern wall, where ancient oak trees provided shade and solitude. The palace was a massive structure that had housed his family for over 3 centuries. Its towering spires and intricate stonework told stories of battles won and lost, of kings who had ruled with wisdom and others who had fallen to their own ambitions. Alexander knew these stories well, having heard them countless times from his grandmother, the Queen Mother, who seemed to remember every detail of their family's history. As he walked along the cobblestone path, Alexander noticed how unusually quiet the grounds seemed today. Normally, servants bustled about tending to various tasks. Gardeners worked among the flower beds and guards patrolled their assigned routes with clockwork precision. But today felt different, almost eerily still. The only sounds were his own footsteps and the distant chirping of birds in the trees. The young prince had developed a habit of observing people, a skill his mother insisted would serve him well when he eventually took the throne. She often reminded him that a good ruler must understand not just the grand gestures of statecraft, but the small details of human behavior that revealed true character. Alexander had taken this advice to heart, though he sometimes wondered if his tendency to notice things others missed was more curse than gift. As he rounded a corner near the armory, Alexander spotted a figure in the distance that immediately caught his attention. It was Thomas, one of the royal sentries he had known since childhood. Thomas had served the royal family for nearly 15 years, having started as a young man not much older than Alexander was now. He was known throughout the palace for his unwavering dedication and his kind demeanor toward everyone, regardless of their station. But something was wrong with the scene before him. Thomas stood at his assigned post near the main gate, his posture rigid and alert as always. However, his movements were strange and jerky, as if he was engaged in some kind of struggle. His arms moved in sharp defensive motions, and his head turned rapidly from side to side, tracking something that Alexander couldn't see. Intrigued and concerned, Alexander moved closer, keeping to the shadows of the garden wall to avoid being noticed. As he drew nearer, he could see Thomas more clearly, and what he witnessed made his blood run cold. The sentry was indeed fighting, but his opponent was invisible to Alexander's eyes. Thomas's sword was drawn, gleaming in the afternoon light as he parried and thrust at empty air. The young prince watched in fascination and growing alarm as Thomas executed perfect combat techniques against his unseen adversary. His footwork was precise, his blade work flawless, but he was clearly struggling. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool afternoon air, and his breathing was labored as if he had been fighting for some time. Alexander had witnessed many sword training sessions and even participated in several himself. He recognized skill when he saw it, and Thomas was demonstrating extraordinary ability. But against what? The prince strained his eyes, looking for any sign of what the sentry might be battling. He saw nothing but air, yet Thomas continued his desperate fight with unwavering determination. The most unsettling aspect was Thomas's silence. In all his years of training and observation, Alexander had never seen a soldier fight so intensely without making a sound. No grunts of effort, no calls for help, no war cries, just the whisper of steel cutting through air and the soft shuffle of feet on stone. As Alexander continued to watch, he noticed other disturbing details. Thomas's uniform, normally immaculate, showed signs of damage. There were small tears in the fabric, and what appeared to be scratches on his armor, as if something with claws had raked across the metal. Yet still, Alexander could see no evidence of whatever was causing this damage. The prince felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the implications of what he was witnessing. Either Thomas had lost his mind and was fighting phantoms of his own imagination, or something truly supernatural was happening within the supposedly safe confines of the royal palace. Neither explanation brought any comfort. Alexander's mind raced as he tried to decide what to do. His first instinct was to run for help, to alert the captain of the guard or even his father. But something held him back. Thomas was clearly in distress, and Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that, Interrupting the fight might somehow make things worse for the loyal sentry. He also couldn't ignore the possibility that this was some kind of test or training exercise he wasn't aware of. The royal family had many secrets, and despite his position as heir to the throne, Alexander knew there were aspects of palace operations that remained hidden from him. Perhaps this was one of them. But as he continued to observe, the intensity of Thomas's struggle became increasingly apparent. The sentry's movements were becoming more desperate, his defenses less precise. Whatever he was fighting seemed to be gaining the upper hand. Alexander could see fresh scratches appearing on Thomas's armor even as he watched, as if invisible claws were finding their mark. The young prince found himself caught between his desire to help and his uncertainty about what he was actually witnessing. Years of royal training had taught him the importance of careful observation and measured response, but nothing had prepared him for a situation like this. How do you help someone fight an enemy you cannot see? As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the palace grounds, Alexander made a decision that would change everything. He stepped out from his hiding place and began walking slowly toward Thomas, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. Whatever was happening here, he could not simply stand by and watch a loyal servant of the crown fight alone against the unknown. The moment his foot touched the cobblestone path leading to Thomas's post, the sentry's head snapped in his direction. For just an instant their eyes met, and Alexander saw something in Thomas's gaze that chilled him to the bone. It wasn't just fear or exhaustion he saw there, but a deep, profound sorrow, as if Thomas was fighting not just for his life, but for his very soul. Then Thomas's attention was pulled back to his invisible battle, and Alexander realized with growing dread that whatever was happening here was far more serious than he had initially thought. The young prince was about to become involved in something that would test everything he thought he knew about the world, about duty, and about the true cost of courage. Alexander approached Thomas with careful, measured steps, his mind racing through possible explanations for what he was witnessing. As he drew closer, the air around him seemed to grow thick and oppressive, as if he was walking through invisible molasses. The temperature dropped noticeably, and his breath began to form small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. Thomas continued his desperate battle, now clearly aware of Alexander's presence but unable to break away from whatever held his attention. The sentry's movements were becoming more frantic, his sword cutting through the air with increasing speed and desperation. Alexander could hear the faint whistle of the blade as it moved, and occasionally a strange sound like metal striking something solid, though nothing visible occupied the space where Thomas directed his attacks. When Alexander reached a distance of about 10 feet from the embattled sentry, something extraordinary happened. The world around him shimmered like heat waves rising from sun-baked stone, and suddenly he could see what Thomas was fighting. The creature was unlike anything from the natural world. It stood roughly 8 feet tall, with a humanoid shape but proportions that seemed wrong in every way. Its limbs were too long, its joints bent at impossible angles, and its skin appeared to be made of shifting shadows that moved independently of the creature's form. Most terrifying of all were its eyes, which glowed with a sickly yellow light, and seemed to bore into Alexander's soul the moment it became aware of his presence. The prince stumbled backward, his hand instinctively reaching for the ceremonial sword at his side, though he knew such a weapon would be of little use against something that appeared to be made of living darkness. The creature turned its attention from Thomas for just a moment, fixing those horrible yellow eyes on Alexander, and the young prince felt a wave of pure malevolence wash over him. In that instant of distraction, Thomas pressed his attack with renewed vigor. His blade, which Alexander could now see was glowing with a faint blue light, cut deep into the creature's arm. The thing let out a sound that was part shriek, part roar, and part something else entirely, something that made Alexander's teeth ache and his vision blur. The creature's wound bled not blood, but a dark substance that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Where the strange liquid touched the ground, the grass withered and died instantly, leaving behind patches of blackened earth that steamed in the cool air. Thomas used the creature's momentary distraction to launch a series of rapid strikes, each one finding its mark and drawing forth more of that terrible dark substance. But the wounds seemed to heal almost as quickly as they were inflicted, the shadow stuff flowing back together like water seeking its own level. Alexander realized with growing horror that Thomas had been fighting this losing battle for who knew how long. The sentry's strength was clearly flagging, his movements becoming slower and less precise with each passing moment. Yet he continued to fight with a determination that spoke of either incredible courage or complete desperation. The creature seemed to sense Thomas's weakening condition and pressed its attack with renewed fury. Its claws, which Alexander could now see were like curved daggers of pure darkness, raked across Thomas's armor with a sound like fingernails on slate. The protective metal, which had served the sentry well in battles against human foes, offered little resistance to the supernatural assault. Fresh wounds appeared on Thomas's arms and chest, bleeding real blood that contrasted starkly with the creature's dark ichor. The sentry grimaced in pain but did not cry out, maintaining the eerie silence that had characterized the entire battle. Alexander found his voice at last, though it came out as little more than a whisper. "Thomas, what is that thing?" The sentry managed to spare him a glance between defensive moves. "Shadow demon, Your Highness," he gasped, his voice strained with effort. "Been fighting it for near an hour. Can't hold much longer." The creature seemed to understand their words, or perhaps it simply sensed the communication between them. It let out another of those horrible sounds and launched itself at Thomas with increased ferocity. The sentry barely managed to get his sword up in time to prevent the claws from reaching his throat. Alexander's mind raced through everything he had ever learned about royal protocol and crisis management. None of it had prepared him for dealing with supernatural threats within the palace walls. He knew he should run for help, alert the guards, summon his father and the court advisors. But he also knew that Thomas would not survive long enough for help to arrive. The young prince made another decision that would have consequences far beyond what he could imagine at that moment. Instead of fleeing, he drew his ceremonial sword and stepped forward to join the battle. The moment his blade cleared its sheath, Alexander felt a strange tingling sensation run through his arm. The sword, which had always been merely decorative in his mind, suddenly felt different in his hand. It seemed lighter somehow, perfectly balanced, and there was a warmth emanating from the metal that spread up through his arm and into his chest. The creature noticed his approach immediately and seemed to grow larger, its shadow form expanding and becoming more solid, those terrible yellow eyes fixed on Alexander with what could only be described as hunger, as if the prince represented something particularly appetizing. Thomas saw what Alexander was attempting and shook his head desperately. "No, Your Highness. You must not. It will destroy you." But Alexander was already moving, his sword raised and his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. As he closed the distance to the creature, he felt something awakening within him, something that had been dormant his entire life but was now stirring to consciousness like a sleeper waking from a long dream. The creature turned to face him fully, momentarily ignoring Thomas, and Alexander got his first clear look at its face. What he saw there was worse than he had imagined. It wasn't just alien or frightening, it was actively malevolent, radiating a hatred so pure and concentrated that it seemed to have physical weight. The thing's mouth opened to reveal rows of teeth like black glass, and it spoke in a voice that sounded like grinding stone. "Young princeling, you have no idea what forces you meddle with. Your bloodline carries old debts, and I have come to collect." Alexander felt his knees go weak at the creature's words, but he forced himself to remain standing. Whatever this thing meant about his bloodline and old debts, he could worry about that later. Right now, Thomas needed his help, and that was all that mattered. The creature raised one massive claw to strike at the approaching prince. But Thomas, seeing the danger, threw himself between them with a desperate lunge. His glowing blade caught the creature in the side, eliciting another of those terrible shrieks. But the demon's other claw caught Thomas across the chest, sending him sprawling across the cobblestones. Now Alexander stood alone before the shadow demon, his ceremonial sword feeling woefully inadequate in his trembling hands. The creature looked down at him with those burning yellow eyes and smiled a smile that promised nothing but pain and darkness. But as the demon raised its claws for what would surely be a killing blow, Alexander felt that strange warmth in his sword grow stronger, and he realized that perhaps this blade was not as ceremonial as he had always believed. The warmth in Alexander's sword suddenly exploded into brilliant white light, so intense that both he and the shadow demon were momentarily blinded. The creature stumbled backward, its form seeming to waver and become less solid in the presence of the radiant energy emanating from the prince's blade. Alexander stared at his weapon in amazement, the ceremonial sword which he had carried for years without giving it much thought. was now blazing with an inner fire that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. The metal itself appeared to be transforming, becoming more refined and pure with each passing second, as if centuries of tarnish and neglect were being burned away. The shadow demon recovered from its initial shock and let out a roar of rage that shook the very stones of the palace wall. "Impossible!" it shrieked, its voice now tinged with something that might have been fear. The bloodline was broken. The covenant was severed. Alexander had no idea what the creature meant, but he could sense that something fundamental had changed in the dynamic of the battle. Where before the demon had been confident and predatory, now it seemed wary, even defensive. The young prince pressed his advantage, raising the glowing sword and advancing toward his supernatural opponent. Behind him, Thomas was struggling to his feet, blood seeping from the deep gashes across his chest. The loyal sentry's eyes were wide with wonder as he took in the transformation of the prince's weapon. "The Lightbringer," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "By all the old gods, it's the Lightbringer." The demon's reaction to these words was immediate and violent. It launched itself at Alexander with desperate fury, its claws extended and its shadow form seeming to expand until it loomed over the prince like a living nightmare. But when its claws met the blade of the transformed sword, there was an explosion of light and darkness that sent shockwaves through the air. Alexander felt the impact run up his arms and into his shoulders, but he held firm. The sword seemed to guide his movements as if it had a will of its own, and he found himself executing defensive techniques he had never learned. Each contact between the blade and the demon's claws resulted in another burst of purifying light, and each burst caused the creature to become more translucent and less substantial. The battle moved across the courtyard in a deadly dance, with Alexander using the sword's light to drive the demon back step by step. Thomas, despite his injuries, managed to rejoin the fight, his own blade still glowing with its fainter blue radiance. Together they began to coordinate their attacks, forcing the shadow demon into an increasingly desperate defensive position. But the creature was far from finished. With a sound like tearing silk, it suddenly split itself into 3 separate forms, each one smaller than the original but no less dangerous. The 3 shadow demons circled the 2 humans, looking for openings in their defense. Alexander found himself facing 2 of the creatures while Thomas engaged the 3rd. The young prince's inexperience showed as he struggled to defend against multiple attackers, and one of the demons managed to rake its claws across his shoulder, leaving burning scratches that felt like lines of ice and fire combined. The pain was unlike anything Alexander had ever experienced, but it also seemed to awaken something deeper within him. The light from his sword grew even brighter, and he began to understand that the weapon was not just a tool, but a conduit for something much greater than himself. Images flashed through his mind, memories that were not his own. He saw ancient kings wielding the same blade against creatures of darkness, watched as his ancestors fought battles in realms that existed between the world of light and shadow. He understood suddenly that his bloodline carried not just royal privilege, but an ancient responsibility to stand guard against forces that sought to consume the light itself. With this new understanding came new strength. Alexander's movements became more fluid and purposeful, his strikes more precise and devastating. The light from his sword began to take on different qualities, sometimes blazing like the sun, other times flowing like liquid starlight, always adapting to what was needed in each moment of the battle. One of the shadow demons made the mistake of pressing its attack too aggressively, and Alexander's response was swift and final. The Lightbringer's blade passed through the creature's core, and instead of the dark ichor that had flowed from previous wounds, there was only a brilliant flash of light as the demon was completely destroyed, leaving nothing behind but a few wisps of dissipating shadow. The remaining 2 demons, seeing the fate of their companion, began to retreat toward the palace walls, but Thomas, despite his wounds, moved to cut off their escape route, his blue glowing blade weaving a barrier of light that the creatures dared not cross. Alexander pursued the demons he had been fighting, and this time there was no hesitation in his movements. The sword seemed to sing in his hands as he brought it down in a perfect arc that caught the second shadow demon across what might have been its neck. Like its companion, the creature dissolved into nothingness with a final shriek of rage and defeat. The last demon, trapped between Alexander's advance and Thomas's barrier, made one final desperate attempt to escape. It launched itself directly upward, its shadow form stretching and distorting as it tried to reach the top of the palace wall. But Alexander was ready for this maneuver. Drawing on instincts he hadn't known he possessed, the prince raised the Lightbringer above his head and channeled all of his energy into the blade. The sword's light expanded outward in a dome of pure radiance that encompassed the entire courtyard. When the light touched the fleeing demon, the creature let out a wail of anguish and simply ceased to exist, as if it had never been there at all. In the sudden silence that followed the demon's destruction, Alexander became aware of the cost of the battle. His body ached from wounds he didn't remember receiving, and he felt drained in a way that went far deeper than physical exhaustion. The Lightbringer's glow was fading, returning to the appearance of an ordinary ceremonial sword, though Alexander suspected it would never truly be ordinary to him again. Thomas was leaning heavily against the wall, his breathing labored and his face pale from blood loss. The loyal sentry looked at Alexander with a mixture of respect and concern that the prince had never seen before. "Your Highness," Thomas said quietly, "there are things about your heritage that you need to know, things that have been kept secret for your own protection. But after what just happened here, those secrets can no longer be maintained." Alexander nodded, though he wasn't sure he was ready for whatever revelations were coming. The weight of the sword in his hand seemed to have grown heavier, not with physical mass, but with the burden of responsibility he now understood it represented. As if summoned by some invisible signal, other figures began to appear around the courtyard. Palace guards emerged from doorways and archways, but they moved with a purposefulness that suggested they had been waiting for this moment. At their head walked a figure Alexander recognized but had never expected to see here. Master Aldrich, the elderly scholar who had tutored him in ancient history and languages. But now Aldrich carried himself differently, with an authority that spoke of knowledge and power far beyond academic learning. In his hands was a staff topped with a crystal that pulsed with the same type of light that had emanated from Alexander's sword. "The awakening has begun," Aldrich said solemnly, his eyes meeting Alexander's with a gravity that made the prince's stomach clench with apprehension. "The old powers stir, and the ancient enemies move in the shadows once more. Your real education, Prince Alexander, is about to begin." Master Aldrich approached with measured steps, his crystal-topped staff tapping against the cobblestones in a rhythm that seemed oddly familiar to Alexander. The other guards formed a protective circle around the courtyard, but their attention was focused outward, as if watching for additional threats rather than protecting against the prince himself. "Thomas needs medical attention," Alexander said, his voice hoarse from the strain of battle. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, and he was becoming more aware of his own injuries, as well as the sentry's more serious wounds. "Already being attended to," Aldrich replied, gesturing to two figures who emerged from the shadows carrying what appeared to be medical supplies. Alexander was surprised to recognize them as kitchen servants he had seen countless times, but they moved with the efficiency and knowledge of trained healers as they began tending to Thomas's wounds. The young prince watched in growing confusion, as these familiar faces revealed skills and knowledge he had never suspected. One of them, a woman named Martha who had served him meals for years, was applying some kind of glowing salve to Thomas's deepest cuts, and Alexander could see the wounds beginning to close almost immediately. "Nothing in this palace is quite what it seems, Your Highness," Aldrich said, noting Alexander's bewildered expression. "We have all been guardians in our own ways, waiting for the day when your true heritage would awaken. That day has arrived sooner than we anticipated." Alexander looked down at the sword in his hands, which now appeared perfectly ordinary despite what he had just experienced. "The Lightbringer," he said, remembering Thomas's words. "What is it really?" Aldrich's expression grew grave. "It is one of 7 blades forged in the early days of the kingdom, when the barriers between our world and the realm of shadows were thin and constantly under assault. Your ancestor, King Aldwin I, commissioned their creation as a last defense against the darkness that sought to consume everything we held dear." The elderly scholar gestured toward a bench near the wall, and Alexander gratefully sank onto it, his legs suddenly feeling unsteady. The weight of revelation was proving more exhausting than the physical battle had been. Each blade was bound to a bloodline, Aldrich continued, settling beside the prince. 7 royal houses, 7 swords, 7 guardians against the dark. Over the centuries, 6 of the houses fell to war, plague, or political upheaval. Their swords were lost, hidden or destroyed. Only the Lightbringer remained, passed down through your family line, though its true nature has been concealed for generations. Alexander absorbed this information slowly, trying to reconcile it with everything he thought he knew about his family's history. Why was it concealed? Why wasn't I told? Because knowledge of the old powers brings danger, Aldrich replied. There are forces in this world and others that hunt those who carry the ancient bloodlines. Your parents thought that if the sword's power remained dormant, if you never learned to awaken it, you might live a normal life free from that burden. But something changed, Alexander said, understanding beginning to dawn. The attack today wasn't random, was it? Aldrich shook his head grimly. 3 days ago, our watchers reported unusual activity in the Shadow Realm. Dark creatures that had not been seen for decades began massing near the barriers that separate our worlds. We increased security and prepared defensive measures, but we had hoped the threat would pass without incident. Thomas, who had been listening while receiving treatment, managed to speak despite his weakness. The demon knew about the bloodline, Your Highness. It spoke of old debts and a broken covenant. This was a targeted attack. The implications of this sent a chill down Alexander's spine. You mean they're specifically hunting me? Not just you, Aldrich said carefully. There are others scattered across the kingdoms, descendants of the other guardian bloodlines. Most don't know their heritage just as you didn't, but the enemy has ways of finding them, and once they do. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Alexander could imagine the fate that awaited those who possessed the ancient power, but lacked the knowledge or training to defend themselves. How many others are there? Alexander asked. We know of perhaps a dozen scattered across 3 kingdoms, Aldrich replied. There may be more who have successfully hidden their lineage, or whose bloodlines have become so diluted that they no longer carry the genetic markers we can detect. Alexander stood and began pacing, his mind racing through the implications of what he was learning. So what happens now? Do we try to find them? Warn them? Some of that work has already begun, Aldrich said. But first you need training. The awakening of the Lightbringer was impressive, but it was also crude and instinctive. Without proper instruction, the sword's power could be as dangerous to you as to your enemies. As if to emphasize his point, Alexander noticed that his hands were trembling slightly, and there was a persistent ache behind his eyes that hadn't been there before the battle. Using the sword's power had clearly taken a toll on his body that he was only beginning to understand. How long will this training take? Alexander asked. That depends on many factors, Aldrich replied. Your natural aptitude, the intensity of the threat we face, and how quickly the enemy can locate and strike at other bloodline carriers. We may have months or we may have days. One of the healer's servants approached them, the one Alexander had known as Martha. Master Aldrich, we need to move Thomas to the secure medical facility. His wounds are deeper than they appear, and there may be shadow taint that requires specialized treatment. Alexander had never heard the term shadow taint before, but it sounded ominous. Is he going to be all right? Martha's expression was reassuring but serious. Shadow demon claws carry a spiritual poison that can corrupt the soul if not properly cleansed. But we caught it early, and Thomas is strong. He should recover fully with proper care. As they prepared to move the injured sentry, Thomas grasped Alexander's arm weakly. Your Highness, he whispered. There's something else you should know. The demon. It wasn't alone when it first appeared. There were others, but they withdrew when I engaged this one in battle. I think this was a test. The blood drained from Alexander's face. A test of what? Of your defenses, Aldrich answered grimly. They wanted to see how quickly you would awaken to your heritage, how strong your power would be, and what kind of protection surrounds you. Now they have their answers. Alexander felt a crushing weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. So I've made things worse by fighting back? No, Aldrich said firmly. You've bought us time and proven that the bloodline remains strong. If you had failed to awaken the Lightbringer, or if its power had been weak, they would have pressed their attack immediately. Now they'll need time to reassess and plan their next move. As Thomas was carefully lifted onto a stretcher and carried away, Alexander noticed that the other servants and guards were beginning to disperse, but not in the casual way of people returning to normal duties. They moved with purpose and coordination, taking up new positions and implementing what was clearly a predetermined security protocol. "Master Aldrich," Alexander said, "how many people in the palace know about this?" "More than you might think. Fewer than we would like," the scholar replied cryptically. "Your father knows, of course, as did your mother before her death. Most of the senior staff have some awareness of the supernatural threats we face, though not all understand the full scope of the situation." Alexander thought about his father, King Edmund, and tried to imagine him carrying this burden of knowledge while maintaining the facade of normal royal duties. "Does he have one of the swords too?" "No," Aldrich said sadly. "The power skips generations sometimes, and your father was not chosen by the blade. That's part of why your awakening was kept secret from you for so long. There was hope that the power might pass you by as well." "But it didn't," Alexander said, looking down at the deceptively ordinary sword at his side. "No, it didn't. And now that it has awakened, there's no going back. The enemy knows you exist, knows where you are, and will not stop until either you are destroyed or they are defeated. The war your ancestors fought is beginning again, and whether you wanted it or not, you are now one of its primary weapons." Alexander closed his eyes and tried to process everything he had learned. When he opened them again, his expression had changed, taking on a resolve that made him look older than his 17 years. "Then we'd better make sure I'm ready for whatever comes next." The training began before dawn the next morning, in a part of the palace Alexander had never known existed. Aldrich led him through a hidden passage behind his father's study, down stone steps that seemed far older than the rest of the castle's architecture. The walls were carved with symbols that made Alexander's eyes water when he tried to focus on them directly. "The old protections," Aldrich explained when he noticed the prince's discomfort. "They were placed here centuries ago to keep shadow creatures from infiltrating the deeper levels of the palace. Your bloodline allows you to pass, but the symbols still create a mild disorientation until you learn to shield your mind properly." They descended for what felt like several stories, though Alexander knew that should have taken them well below the foundation level of the palace. When they finally reached their destination, he found himself in a vast circular chamber lit by crystals that glowed with the same pure light he had seen in his sword. The room was clearly designed for combat training, with weapon racks along the walls, practice dummies made of some kind of dark material that seemed to absorb light, and marked areas on the floor that suggested specific training patterns. But what drew Alexander's attention immediately was the figure waiting for them in the center of the chamber. She was a woman of perhaps 30 years, with silver-streaked dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge and pain. She wore simple dark clothing that allowed for easy movement, and at her side hung a sword that, even sheathed, radiated an aura of power that made the hair on Alexander's arm stand up. "Your Highness," she said, offering a bow that was respectful but not subservient. "I am Captain Lyra Blackthorne, and I will be overseeing your combat training." Alexander returned the bow uncertainly. The name Blackthorne was familiar, though he couldn't immediately place where he had heard it. "Captain," he said, "forgive me, but I don't recall seeing you among the palace guard." A slight smile crossed her face. "That's because I'm not part of the palace guard, at least not in any conventional sense. I serve the crown in matters that require specialized knowledge." Aldrich stepped forward to provide clarification. "Captain Blackthorne is one of the few remaining members of the Shadow Guard, an order that has protected the royal bloodlines for over 4 centuries. She carries Nightfall, one of the 7 guardian blades." Alexander's eyes widened as he understood the implications. "You're one of the other bloodline carriers." "I am," Lyra confirmed, her hand moving instinctively to her sword hilt. "Though my awakening happened under very different circumstances than yours. I've been training with Nightfall for 15 years, and I've faced the shadow creatures more times than I care to count." This revelation raised immediate questions in Alexander's mind. "If you've been fighting them for 15 years, why didn't anyone tell me about you?" "Why wasn't I brought into this earlier?" Lyra's expression darkened. "Because 15 years ago, my entire family was slaughtered by shadow demons in a single night. My village was consumed by darkness so complete that it still appears as a dead zone on maps of the Northern Territories. I was the only survivor, and only because Nightfall awakened in response to my desperation." The weight of her words settled over the chamber like a physical presence, Alexander began to understand why his parents had been so reluctant to awaken him to this heritage. The power came with a terrible cost. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, meaning it deeply. "Don't be sorry," Lyra replied, her voice hardening. "Be ready, because what happened to my family is exactly what will happen to everyone you care about if you're not prepared when the real attack comes." She drew Nightfall in one fluid motion, and Alexander gasped at the sight of it. Where the Lightbringer had blazed with pure white radiance, Nightfall seemed to absorb light around it, creating a blade of star-filled darkness that was somehow beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The Guardian blades were forged as pairs, Aldrich explained. Light and shadow, creation and destruction, mercy and justice. They are most powerful when working in harmony, but each blade chooses its own path and its own wielder. Lyra moved to the center of the practice area and gestured for Alexander to join her. "Before we begin physical training, you need to understand what you're truly fighting against. Draw the Lightbringer." Alexander hesitated for a moment, then drew his sword. To his surprise, it immediately began to glow, though not as intensely as it had during the battle with the Shadow Demon. The light seemed somehow responsive to his emotional state, growing brighter when he felt determined and dimming when doubt crept into his mind. "Good," Lyra said. "The blade is bonding with you properly. Now I'm going to show you something that may disturb you, but it's necessary for your education." She raised Nightfall and spoke a word in a language Alexander didn't recognize. The chamber around them seemed to shift and change, the walls becoming transparent to reveal a vast landscape of twisted trees and gray sky. Shadow creatures moved in the distance, hundreds of them, all heading in the same direction. "This is the Shadow Realm," Lyra explained, her voice taking on an otherworldly quality. "It exists parallel to our own world, separated by barriers that grow weaker with each passing year. What you're seeing is not a vision or illusion, but a real-time view of what lies just beyond the veil of our reality." Alexander watched in horror as the Shadow Army moved across the desolate landscape. There were creatures like the one he had fought, but also others. Things with too many limbs or eyes or teeth. Abominations that defied description. At their head rode a figure that was unmistakably humanoid, but radiated such malevolence that Alexander had to look away. "Who is that?" he managed to ask. "The Shadow King," Aldrich replied grimly. "The source of the darkness that has plagued our world for millennia. He was once human, a sorcerer who sought immortality and power beyond measure. He found both, but at the cost of his humanity and soul." The vision faded as Lyra lowered her sword, and the chamber returned to its normal appearance, but the image of that vast army remained burned into Alexander's memory. "How many are there?" he asked. "More than we can count," Lyra replied, "but numbers aren't their only advantage. They're also patient. The Shadow King has been building his forces for decades, waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment appears to be now." Alexander felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were facing. How can we possibly stand against an army like that? "The same way our ancestors did," Lyra said firmly. "By using the power of the Guardian Blades, by working together, and by remembering that light, no matter how small, can push back even the deepest darkness." She moved to one of the weapon racks and selected a practice sword made of the same light-absorbing material as the training dummies. "But first you need to learn to fight properly. Your instincts yesterday were good, but instinct alone won't keep you alive when you face multiple opponents or more powerful creatures." The next several hours were a grueling introduction to combat techniques Alexander had never imagined. Lyra pushed him through exercises designed to build not just physical strength and speed, but mental focus and spiritual resilience. She taught him how to channel the Lightbringer's power in controlled bursts rather than the wild explosions he had produced during the demon. "Attack. The blade's power comes from your will and your connection to the light within yourself," she explained as Alexander struggled to maintain a steady glow from his sword. "Fear, anger, and desperation can trigger powerful responses, but they're unreliable and exhausting. True mastery comes from finding the calm center within yourself and drawing power from that source." As the training progressed, Alexander began to understand that becoming a Guardian Blade wielder required more than just learning to fight. It was about fundamentally changing how he viewed himself and his place in the world. The carefree prince who had wandered the palace gardens just yesterday was gone, replaced by someone who carried the weight of ancient responsibilities. During a brief rest period, Aldrich shared more details about the other bloodline carriers they were trying to locate. We've identified a blacksmith's daughter in the eastern provinces who shows strong potential, and there are reports of unusual incidents around a merchant family in the coastal cities that suggest another awakening may be imminent. How do we reach them? Alexander asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. Carefully, Lyra replied. The enemy has agents in the human world, people who have been corrupted by shadow magic or promised power in exchange for their service. Moving openly to contact the other carriers would expose them to attack. So what's the plan? Aldrich and Lyra exchanged a look that Alexander had learned to recognize as the prelude to news he wouldn't like. Tomorrow night, Aldrich said slowly, there will be a gathering. Representatives from the neighboring kingdoms along with certain individuals who possess knowledge of the old ways. It's been planned for months under the guise of a diplomatic conference, but its true purpose is to coordinate our response to the growing shadow threat. That sounds dangerous, Alexander observed. It is, Lyra confirmed. Bringing together so many people with knowledge of the guardian bloodlines and the ancient powers will create a concentration of light energy that the enemy will find irresistible. We're essentially using ourselves as bait. I'm. Alexander felt his stomach clench with anxiety. And I'm expected to attend this gathering? Not just attend, Aldrich said gravely. As the awakened carrier of the Lightbringer, you'll be one of the primary focuses of the meeting. The other kingdoms need to see that the ancient bloodlines are awakening again, that there's hope in the coming darkness. No pressure, Alexander muttered, earning a slight smile from Lyra. Actually, she said, then there's enormous pressure, because if the shadow forces attack during the gathering, it will be up to you and whatever other guardian blade wielders we can assemble to hold them off long enough for the others to escape. Alexander looked down at the Lightbringer, trying to imagine himself as the kind of hero these people needed him to be. The sword's gentle glow seemed to pulse encouragingly, and he realized that whether he felt ready or not, events were moving beyond his control. Then I guess we'd better make sure I'm as prepared as possible, he said, raising the practice sword again. Let's continue the training. The diplomatic gathering was set to take place in the Great Hall, a massive chamber that could accommodate hundreds of guests. Alexander stood before a mirror in his chambers, adjusting the formal robes that marked his status as heir to the throne. Hidden beneath the ceremonial garments, the Lightbringer hung at his side, its presence both comforting and terrifying. The past 24 hours of intensive training had left Alexander feeling more confident in his abilities, but also more aware of how much he still had to learn. Lyra had pushed him through combat scenarios that grew progressively more challenging, teaching him to fight multiple shadow creatures simultaneously and to coordinate his attacks with other guardian blade wielders. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called, expecting to see one of his usual servants. Instead, his father, King Edmund, stepped into the room. The older man's face was grave, and Alexander could see the weight of worry in his eyes. "Father," Alexander said, uncertain how to begin a conversation about everything that had transpired. "I know what happened in the courtyard," Edmund said quietly, closing the door behind him. "Aldrich told me about your awakening, and about the training you've been receiving." Alexander waited, unsure whether his father was angry or proud or simply concerned for his safety. "I had hoped this day would never come," Edmund continued, moving to the window that overlooked the palace grounds. "When you were born, your mother and I prayed that the bloodline would pass you by, that you could live a normal life free from the burdens that have plagued our family for generations. But it didn't pass me by," Alexander said. "No," Edmund agreed, turning back to face his son. "And now that the power has awakened, I find myself torn between pride and terror. Pride at the man you're becoming, and terror at what that might cost you." Alexander joined his father at the window, looking out at the gardens where his carefree life had ended just 2 days ago. "Master Aldrich told me you don't carry one of the guardian blades." "I don't," Edmund confirmed. "The Lightbringer responded to my father, your grandfather, but when he died, it went dormant until you awakened it. For 30 years, I've ruled this kingdom knowing that greater threats existed but being powerless to face them directly." "That must have been difficult," Alexander said, beginning to understand the isolation his father had endured. "It was," Edmund admitted, "but it also taught me the importance of building alliances, of finding strength in unity rather than relying solely on individual power." That's why tonight's gathering is so crucial. As if summoned by their conversation, Aldrich appeared in the doorway. Your Majesty, Your Highness, it's time. The guests have arrived and the evening's proceedings are about to begin. Edmund placed a hand on Alexander's shoulder. Remember, you're not just representing our kingdom tonight. You're representing hope itself for everyone who opposes the darkness. The great hall had been transformed for the occasion. Banners from a dozen kingdoms hung from the walls, and tables were arranged in a complex pattern that Alexander realized was actually a geometric design meant to channel and focus magical energies. Representatives from neighboring realms mingled with figures he didn't recognize, though their bearing suggested they were people of significant importance. Lyra appeared at his side as he entered, looking elegant in formal attire that nonetheless allowed for easy movement. Nightfall was concealed beneath her dress, but Alexander could sense its presence. Stay alert, she murmured.
Several of the people here aren't entirely human, and some of the humans aren't entirely trustworthy. As the evening progressed, Alexander was introduced to a bewildering array of individuals.
There was Lord Garrett from the Mountain Kingdoms, whose handshake revealed calluses that spoke of sword work rather than courtly pursuits. Lady Serena from the coastal cities carried herself with a grace that seemed almost supernatural, and when she smiled, Alexander caught glimpses of teeth that were perhaps too sharp. But the most remarkable introduction came when Aldrich led him to a young woman about his own age, dressed in the simple clothes of a traveling merchant. Your Highness, Aldrich said formally, may I present Elena Brightforge, recently arrived from the eastern provinces. The moment their hands touched in greeting, Alexander felt a shock of recognition. Power called to power, and he knew immediately that Elena was another guardian blade carrier. Her eyes widened with the same realization. The Dawnbreaker, she whispered, her hand moving unconsciously to where a weapon was concealed beneath her cloak. You're the blacksmith's daughter, Alexander said. Remembering Aldrich's earlier words, Elena nodded, her expression mixing relief with apprehension. I've been having the dreams for weeks now. Visions of shadow creatures and burning darkness. When Master Aldrich's message reached my village, I knew I had to come. Before Alexander could respond, the hall's atmosphere suddenly changed. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the magical lights that illuminated the chamber began to flicker. Conversations died as everyone present sensed that something was wrong. Lyra was at Alexander's side instantly, her hand on Nightfall's hilt. They're here, she said grimly. The enemy has found us. The great doors of the hall burst open, but instead of palace guards or servants, shadow creatures poured through the entrance. These were larger and more solid than the demon Alexander had fought before, and they moved with coordinated purpose that spoke of intelligent command. Chaos erupted as the assembled guests reacted to the threat. Some revealed themselves as warriors, drawing weapons and moving to defensive positions. Others began chanting in languages Alexander didn't recognize, weaving protective spells around those who lacked combat abilities. A few, to his horror, removed masks or shed disguises to reveal their true allegiance to the shadow forces. Alexander drew the Lightbringer without conscious thought, its radiance blazing to life and pushing back the unnatural darkness that had filled the hall. Beside him, Elena revealed the Dawnbreaker, a blade that glowed with the warm golden light of sunrise, while Lyra's Nightfall created a sort of star-filled shadow that cut through the enemy ranks like liquid death. Form a triangle, Lyra shouted over the sounds of battle. The three blades working together can create a barrier to protect the others. Alexander found himself fighting alongside the two women, their blades weaving patterns of light and shadow that held the shadow creatures at bay. But more enemies continued to pour through the doorway, and he could see that they were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. That was when the real nightmare began. The temperature in the hall plummeted to levels that froze breath in the air, and a presence entered that made Alexander's soul recoil in horror. The Shadow King had come personally to claim the guardian blade wielders. The creature that had once been human strode through the melee as if the battle around him was merely an inconvenience. Shadow creatures parted before him, and even the corrupted humans among the guests fell to their knees in his presence. He was tall and imposing, wrapped in darkness that seemed to have physical substance, and his eyes burned with the cold fire of stars dying in the void. So, the Shadow King said, his voice carrying easily over the sounds of combat. The old bloodlines awaken at last. How convenient to find you all gathered in one place. Alexander felt his courage waver as those terrible eyes fixed on him. This was power beyond anything he had imagined, ancient and malevolent and utterly confident in its supremacy. The Lightbringer's glow seemed pitiful in comparison to the darkness that surrounded their enemy. But then Elena stepped forward, the dawnbreaker blazing like a miniature sun in her hands. "You're not welcome here," she said, her voice steady despite the terror Alexander could see in her eyes. The Shadow King laughed, a sound like breaking glass and dying hopes. "Brave words from such a young light. Tell me, child, are you prepared to die for them, if necessary?" Elena replied, and Alexander felt a surge of admiration for her courage. "Then let us test that resolve," the Shadow King said, raising one hand. Darkness flowed from his fingers like liquid night, reaching for Elena with hungry tendrils that promised not just death, but the complete destruction of her soul. Alexander moved without thinking, throwing himself between Elena and the attack. The Lightbringer's blade intercepted the dark energy, and the resulting explosion of conflicting forces sent shockwaves through the hall that shattered windows and cracked the stone walls. When the light and darkness cleared, Alexander found himself on his knees, the Lightbringer's glow flickering weakly. The Shadow King stood unchanged, but there was now something that might have been surprise in his ancient eyes. "Interesting," the Dark Lord mused. "The bloodline is stronger than I anticipated. This may actually prove entertaining." And with those words, Alexander realized that the real battle was only just beginning. Alexander struggled to his feet, drawing strength from the Lightbringer's connection to his will. Around the hall, the battle continued to rage, but he could see that the defenders were losing ground. The Shadow King's personal intervention had shifted the balance decisively in favor of the dark forces. Elena helped steady him, her own blade still blazing with golden light. "Are you all right?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. "I'll survive," Alexander replied, though he wasn't entirely certain that was true. The clash with the Shadow King's power had left him feeling drained in ways he was only beginning to understand. Lyra fought her way through a group of shadow creatures to reach them, nightfall leaving trails of starlight as it cut through the enemy ranks. "We need to get the non-combatants out of here," she called out. "This hall will become a tomb if we don't act soon." Alexander looked around and saw that several of the diplomatic guests had fallen, their bodies showing the withering effects of shadow magic. Others huddled behind overturned tables or pressed against the walls, protected by the spells being maintained by the more magically gifted attendees. "There," Elena pointed toward a side entrance that most of the shadow creatures seemed to be ignoring. "If we can clear a path, we might be able to evacuate through the servants' quarters." "Do it," Alexander said, making a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. "Get them out. I'll keep the Shadow King occupied." Both women stared at him as if he had lost his mind. "Alexander, no," Lyra said firmly. "You're not ready to face him alone. None of us are." "Maybe not," Alexander agreed, "but I'm the one he wants most. If I can draw his attention, give you time to organize an evacuation, you'll die," Elena said bluntly. "Probably," Alexander admitted, "but everyone else will die if we don't try something." The Shadow King seemed to sense their discussion, because he turned his terrible gaze in their direction and began walking toward them. Where his feet touched the ground, the stone cracked and withered as if his very presence was antithetical to the ordered reality of the physical world. "Your Highness," came a voice from behind them. Alexander turned to see Thomas approaching, somehow back on his feet despite the severity of his injuries. The loyal sentry carried his sword, which glowed with its familiar blue light, but there was something different about him now, something that spoke of hidden depths finally revealed. "Thomas, you shouldn't be here," Alexander said. "Your wounds will heal," Thomas interrupted. "But there are things you need to know before you face the Shadow King. Things about your bloodline that even Master Aldrich doesn't fully understand." The Shadow King had paused in his advance, perhaps curious about what revelations were about to unfold. His ancient eyes gleamed with what might have been amusement at the unfolding drama. "The Lightbringer is more than just one of 7 guardian blades," Thomas continued, his voice carrying clearly despite the chaos around them. "It was the first blade, the template from which all others were forged. And your bloodline doesn't just carry the power to wield it, you are its heir in the truest sense." Alexander felt a strange tingling sensation as Thomas spoke, as if something deep within him was responding to the sentry's words. The Lightbringer's glow began to intensify, but this time the light felt different, more complete somehow. "What does that mean?" Alexander asked, though part of him was beginning to understand. "It means," said a new voice, "that you have the potential to do what your ancestors could not." Everyone in the hall turned toward the source of the voice. In the main doorway stood a figure that radiated such pure light that it was difficult to look at directly. As Alexander's eyes adjusted, he realized he was looking at an elderly woman whose very presence seemed to push back the darkness that had filled the chamber. The Shadow King's reaction was immediate and violent. "Impossible!" he snarled, his composure cracking for the first time. "You were destroyed. I felt your light extinguished centuries ago." The woman smiled, and her expression held both infinite compassion and implacable determination. "Death is not the end for those who serve the true light, old friend. Though you seem to have forgotten that lesson." "Old friend," Alexander whispered, confusion mixing with hope as he watched the shadow creatures recoil from the newcomer's radiance. "The Shadow King was not always as you see him now," the woman explained, stepping into the hall without fear. "Once he was the greatest of the guardian blade wielders, the keeper of Lightbringer's twin blade, Shadowbane. But power corrupted him, and in seeking to defeat the darkness by becoming it, he lost himself completely." The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. The monster they faced had once been a hero, someone who had stood where Alexander now stood and made choices that led to damnation instead of salvation. "You speak lies, Halara," the Shadow King spat, but Alexander could hear uncertainty in his voice for the first time. "Do I?" Ilara replied gently. "Tell me, old friend, when did you last remember what it felt like to laugh, to feel joy or hope or love? When did the darkness become so complete that you forgot why you first took up arms against it?" The Shadow King staggered as if struck by a physical blow. Around the hall, his shadow creatures began to waver and fade, their connection to their master weakening as he struggled with memories he had thought long buried. Alexander felt the Lightbringer pulse in his hands, and suddenly he understood what was expected of him. This was not a battle to be won through force of arms, but through something far more difficult and dangerous: the willingness to offer redemption to someone who had fallen so far into darkness that he seemed beyond salvation. "I know what you're thinking," Ilara said, her voice speaking directly to Alexander's mind while her lips didn't move. "And you're right. But understand the cost to truly save him. You will have to risk everything, including your own soul. The Lightbringer can either destroy the darkness within him or be consumed by it. The choice and the consequence will be yours alone." Alexander looked at the Shadow King, trying to see past the centuries of corruption and malevolence to the hero, who had once wielded a guardian blade in defense of the light. It seemed impossible that such a transformation could be reversed, but the woman's presence had already begun to crack the shell of darkness that surrounded their enemy. Elena and Lyra moved to stand beside him, their blades raised not in attack but in support. "Whatever you're planning," Elena said quietly, "we're with you. Even if it means risking everything." Alexander asked. "Especially then," Lyra replied. "That's what the guardian blades were truly meant for. Not just to fight the darkness, but to offer hope even in the face of despair." Alexander raised the Lightbringer, and this time its light was different than any he had produced before. It was warm and welcoming rather than harsh and judgmental, patient rather than urgent, offering rather than demanding. "I don't know if you can be saved," Alexander called out to the Shadow King. "I don't know if you want to be saved. But if any part of the hero you once were still exists, if any fragment of light remains in the darkness you become, then I offer you a choice. Put down your hatred. Remember who you used to be. Let the light find you again." The Shadow King stood frozen, his terrible eyes wide with something that might have been wonder. Around him, the shadow creatures continued to fade as their master's concentration shattered. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the fate of kingdoms hung in the balance as one lost soul struggled to remember what it meant to hope. When the Shadow King finally spoke, his voice was different, smaller, and infinitely tired. "I remember," he whispered. "Oh, by all the lights that ever were, I remember what I used to be." The darkness that had surrounded him for centuries began to crack and fall away like discarded armor, revealing not the monster Alexander had expected, but a man who looked remarkably like what Alexander himself might become given years and wisdom and the weight of impossible choices. My name, the former Shadow King said, his voice growing stronger, was Marcus Dawnwright, and I have been lost in darkness for far too long. As the last of the shadow creatures vanished and the unnatural cold lifted from the great hall, Alexander felt the Lightbringer's glow settle into a steady, comfortable radiance. The immediate crisis had passed, but he understood that this was not an ending so much as a new beginning. The real work of rebuilding what had been broken would take time, patience, and a kind of courage he was only beginning to understand. But as he looked around at the survivors, at Elena and Lyra standing proud beside him, at Thomas and Aldrich and all the others who had risked everything for the chance to push back the darkness, Alexander felt something he had never experienced before, the weight and wonder of being exactly where he